Hello and welcome back to the Ash and Stone channel. My name is Chris and today we're going to carry on with a solo narrative campaign with episode 4.5. And now, if you cast your mind back to episode 3, Edmund the Ox was captured by the Goblins. So well done, Grim Knight, you knew where this was heading. It's time for a rescue mission. I don't think Oathmark is going to suit this scenario, so what I've decided to do is go with Rangers of the Shadow Deep and do up a custom scenario for that. Anyway, let's get into it.
Harbin Moor is shamed. The dwarf prince, Baradoc Kingston's fury, was well placed. The long years of relative peace had made Harbin careless. Relations with the dwarves must be improved. Their friendship stands to make him an even wealthier man. Determined to make up for his mistake, he organizes a group of men to carry out a scouting mission in the woods to the southwest of Goldenfields. The group, led by Reuben Willis, officer of the Goldenfields bowmen, heads out, determined to find the extent of the goblin threat. As luck would have it, as they finish scouting the goblin camp, they spy a beaten and bloodied Edmund the Ox being dragged into a tent on the outskirts of the camp. A plan is hatched. Waiting for nightfall, the group make a desperate raid into the camp in order to rescue the champion of Goldenfields.
The men of Goldenfields will be led by the ranger, Reuben Willis. He is the officer of the Goldenfield bowmen, 2 archers, 3 men-at-arms, and a guardsman. Today's scenario is going to be a prisoner rescue. The men of Goldenfields are going to do a quick raid into this goblin camp in the middle of the night and attempt to rescue Edmund the Ox, who was captured previously. So the scenario is based on the Knoll encampment scenario from the Rangers of the Shadow Deep Ghost Stone supplement. You'll find this particular scenario linked in the description down below if you want to have a go at it yourself. Basically, what the men of Goldenfields have to do is smash into the camp, cut free Edmund the Ox from the central large tent, and then escape off the same board edge that they arrived from. In this case, the left-hand edge. To make things easier and clearer for play, both movement and line of sight will be blocked by the bases of the trees rather than the physicality of the tree itself.
So we start the first turn with a couple of stealth rolls. We have a stealth roll for Reuben, who will need 7s, target number 10, and he gets a +3 from his stealth skill. So he succeeds, and we'll also make a roll for one of the archers, who also receives +3, target number of 10. He also succeeds, so we get to choose 2 goblins to move in any direction we want. So to start with, we'll be moving this particular goblin away off into the distance. And his friend next to him will also go for a walk. Let's start our Rangers phase by activating our Ranger, and we might as well do the 2 companions next to him. And he'll use his first action to move 6 inches. They will follow suit. And then he'll use his second action to advance a couple of inches more. On the creature's turn, we start by checking line of sight. Currently the goblins cannot see any of the men from Goldenfields, so we'll carry on with random movement for them all. Well, those that haven't already activated at least. So let's start with our first guy here. He is going to be going this way, 6 inches. This fella, head this way into the woods, must have heard a strange sound. This fella, I don't like the fact they're all coming back this way. And our last one, there we go. The companions are up next, so we're going to start with a double move from this archer in the corner. And these other three are going to make their move up this way. Here we are at the end of turn 1, already in danger of being spotted. We'll start turn 2 with a couple of stealth rolls. So target number of 10 with a +3 for Reuben succeeds, and for one of the archers fails, so we get to move one goblin. So only succeeding on one stealth check has meant that the jig is going to be up. So let's start by, let's move this archer 6 inches towards us. We'll start the ranger's turn by activating Reuben himself and 2 of his companions within 3 inches. Just. So their first action will be a move. And their second action will be some combat. So as the second action, the Ranger Reuben will fight in combat. He's going to be using his two-handed spear. He will receive +3 base, +4 because this is still a surprise attack, and an additional +4 for having 2 friends in contact with this particular goblin. So he's on +11, and the goblin is a goblin archer at +0. The blue dice will be for the men of Goldenfields, and the red dice will be for the goblins. That is a 15. So the goblin archer has got a 15, and Reuben has got a 22. So Reuben wins that fight, and 22 versus armor of 11 means the goblin takes 11 points of damage and is removed. His 2 mates have still got their second action, so they will use their second action to move up to 3 inches. This one into contact with that goblin. This one moving further up. On to the creature phase. Because a goblin was hurt within line of sight of another goblin, the alarm has now been raised. Let's start with this guy, well in the middle of nowhere. Because of the darkness, he currently doesn't have line of sight on anybody, so he is going to move 6 inches directly towards the target point, the front of the large tent. He can now see all sorts of people. That one there is probably the closest target that he can see. So the Goblin Archer will make a +1 shooting attack against the man-at-arms at the edge of the tent there, who will receive +6. +3 base, +2 because he's got cover behind the tent, and an additional +1 because the goblin moved before he made the shot. So +1 for the goblin, +6 for the man-at-arms. The man-at-arms gets an 11, and the goblin gets an 11. So that shot misses. This fella can see the target in front of him there, so he is going to move in 6 inches, followed by a further 3 as his second action. The Goblin Archer here currently can't see a target to shoot at. I'm going to roll a dice to determine whether he goes this way or that way to get a target to shoot. So 1 to 10 he's going to go to the top, 11 to 20 he's going to go down the bottom. Down the bottom. So we'll move him up to 6 inches down here. We move him to there, then he can draw line of sight to Reuben and take a shot at him. So the Goblin will be +1 for his shoot, and Reuben will be +4, +3 base, and additional +1 because the Goblin Archer moved. So we have an 18 for the Goblin, and a 13 +4, 17 for Reuben. So Reuben is hit. Reuben has an armor of 11. So 18 minus 11, he takes 7 points of damage. That brings him down to 11 remaining. Ouch. This Goblin off the side here is going to move 6 inches, followed by another 3 towards his closest target. And finally this Goblin will be fighting against the Guardsman. So the Goblin Soldier is at a +1 fight. The Guardsman is at +3. So we have a 14 for the Goblin and a 9 for the Guardsman. So the Goblin definitely wins that. 14 versus armor 11 means the Guardsman takes 3 points of damage and has 9 remaining. On the Companion's turn, we're going to start with our first Archer, who can move up to 6 inches. I'm going to move him over here. And he will be making a shot at the Goblin right here. So the Archer is +2 to his shoot. The Goblin is +0 to his fight. But he gets +1 because the Archer already moved. So we have a 20 for the Archer. And we have a 4 for the Goblin. So 20 minus the Goblin's armor of 11 means he takes 9 points of damage, leaving him with 1. We'll activate this Man-at-Arms next, who can make a run around the tent and use his second action to fight that Goblin Archer. So his fight is +3, the Goblin's is +0. We have an 18. 21 versus a 9, so that Goblin is going to go down. This Man-at-Arms is going to activate. He's going to move 6 inches out this way, and then a further 3 into combat with that Goblin. And the final companion to activate will be the Archer back here. He will move 2, and then up to 6 inches this way, and then up to 3, he's just going to shuffle along this way. He's got no targets, so we won't shoot anything. Here we are at the end of turn 2. We will begin turn 3 with the Ranger phase. We'll activate the Ranger and 2 of his mates. This guy and this guy. So we'll move him into contact there. We'll move the Ranger into contact there. So let's start combat with the Ranger Reuben. He receives +3 and then plus an additional 4 for having 2 mates. So he's on +7 versus the Goblin's +1. Oh, that was lucky. So 25 for Reuben and a 3 for the Goblin. So that Goblin there is going to take 13 points of damage. 15 because he gets +2 for the two-handed spear. Next up will be this guy here. He will be making his attack. He is +3 base and he gets +2 for having a friend in combat with him. So he's on +5 versus the Goblin's +1. So we have a 15 versus a 5. So the Goblin loses that one and is going to take 3 points of damage, leaving him on 7. The last guy has his second action left and he is going to move into combat with that Goblin there. Let's start the creature's phase by activating this Goblin Archer, who will be shooting at that man-at-arms. So the Goblin receives +1, the man-at-arms receives +3. So we have a 14 for the Goblin, and we have an 11 for the man-at-arms. So the Goblin manages to hit and causes 2 points of damage, bringing that man-at-arms down to 10 points. We're going to follow that up by activating this Goblin, who will be moving into that same man-at-arms and fighting him. The Goblin is at +1, the man-at-arms is at +3. The Goblin gets a 4, the man-at-arms gets a 21. So 21 compared with armor 12 means that the Goblin takes 9 points of damage and is left with 1. The last Goblin to activate is this one here. He will be fighting against the most wounded target, which is the Guardsman here. So the Goblin receives +1. The Guardsman receives +3 base and then +2 for having a friend next to him. So +5. So the Goblin gets an 11 and the Guardsman gets a 7. So the Goblin manages to win that fight. But 11 isn't going to beat the Guardsman's armor of 12, so no damage. It is now the companion phase. Let's start with this Guardsman here. He's going to use his first action to attack this Goblin. The Goblin receives +1. The Guardsman receives +5, +3 base, and +2 for having a friendly model in base contact with his enemy. The Goblin gets a 14. The Guardsman gets an 8, so the Goblin definitely won that one. 14 versus armor 12 means the Guardsman is going to lose another 2 hit points, down to 7. We're going to follow that up by activating this man-at-arms here, who is going to move through and into the large tent. We then have the 2 archers left. Let's start with this fella. I'm not happy with his line of sight to the Goblin from where he is. So I'm going to make him move over and then take his shot, which is much clearer. So he will receive +2 to his shoot, and the Goblin will receive +1 for him having moved. So the Goblin gets an 18 and the Archer manages to get a 19. So the Archer manages to hit the Goblin. 19 versus armor of 11 means the Goblin takes 8 points of damage and has 2 remaining. We'll follow that up by activating the second Archer, who will move forward so that he has line of sight on the Goblin Archer, and he will be making his shot. Same deal, he gets +2, the Goblin gets +1 because he moved. 2 dice. We have a 3, and that is a 5, so it becomes a 7. So the Archer hits, but not hard enough to do any damage. Let's start the turn 3 event phase by flipping over an event card. We get a Queen, which means we deploy 2 Goblin Archers in front of tent number 3. Additionally, the Goblin Captain comes out of the main tent, and he's going to shove this guy out as well. Let's start turn 4 with the Ranger phase. So we're going to activate the Ranger and 2 of his companions. We're going to say this guy, and why not this guy. So we'll start by moving the Ranger into combat with the Goblin Captain, and then we'll do a fight between the Ranger and the Goblin Captain. So Reuben the Ranger receives +3, plus an additional 2 for having a mate there. The Goblin Captain receives +2 to his fight. So +2 to the Goblin, +5 to Reuben the Ranger. That rolled way away. There was a 7. So 9 for the Goblin and 14 for Reuben the Ranger. So Reuben the Ranger wins that. 14 versus an armor of 12 means the Goblin Captain takes 2 points of damage and has 10 remaining. We'll then attack with his mate here. So that man-at-arms receives +3 and then plus an additional 2 because Reuben the Ranger is in combat with him. So +5 for the man-at-arms and +2 for the Goblin Captain. So 15 for the Goblin Captain, 10 for the man-at-arms. So 15 versus armour of 12 is 3 points of damage, giving this man-at-arms 9 left. The last guy we activated was this fella here. He'll be attacking this Goblin. He will be fight value of 3 +2 for having his mate in combat with him, so he's receiving +5. And this Goblin is receiving +1 from his fight value. So the Goblin gets a 5, the Man-at-Arms gets a 13, +5, 18. 18 versus the Goblin's armour of 12 is 6 points of damage, bringing this Goblin down to 1 remaining. On the Goblin's turn, we are going to start with the Goblin Captain. He will be attacking the target with the lowest health, this Man-at-Arms. The Goblin Captain receives +2, the Man-at-Arms is receiving +5, 3 base, and 2 for having a mate in combat with him. So the Man-at-Arms gets 23, the Goblin gets 7, so the Man-at-Arms definitely won that one there. 23 versus the Goblin Captain's armour of 12 gives us 11 points of damage, which is enough to kill the Goblin Captain. The next Goblins to activate will be these two over by tent number 3. Currently they cannot draw a line of sight to anybody, so they will be making a move 6 inches towards the front of the large tent. So this fella will move 6 inches this way, and this fella will move 6 inches this way. They can both now see a target. This archer can see Reuben the Ranger. This archer can see that Man-at-Arms. The Man-at-Arms will have cover from the tent. Reuben the Ranger will not. So let's start with the Goblin attacking Reuben the Ranger. He is +1 to his shoot. Reuben the Ranger is +3 and plus an additional 1 because the Goblin already moved, so +4. So the Goblin receives an 18 and Reuben the Ranger receives a 16. 18 versus Reuben's armour of 11 means Reuben takes another 7 points, down to 4 left. And this archer here, shooting at that Man-at-Arms, the archer receives +1 because the shoot is +1. The Man-at-Arms receives +3, plus an additional 2 for cover, and plus an additional 1 for the archer having moved, so +6. So we have a 19 for the Goblin Archer and a 25 for the Man-at-Arms, so the shot misses. The Goblin with the next highest health is this archer over here. He can see through the gap at the archers that shot at him previously. So the Goblin receives +1, the archer receives +2. So the Goblin receives a 6, the archer is a 17. So that shot misses. We're going to start with this Goblin. He will be fighting this Man-at-Arms. The Goblin receives +1, the Man-at-Arms receives +3. So the Goblin gets a 17, the Man-at-Arms gets a 13. So 17 versus the Man-at-Arms armour of 12 means he takes another 5 points of damage and has 5 remaining. This final Goblin will be attacking the most wounded character, the Guardsman here. The Goblin receives +1, the Guardsman receives +5, +3 base and +2 for having a friend next to him. The Goblin gets a 3, the Guardsman gets a 15. 15 versus the Goblin's armour of 12 means he'll take 3 points of damage, which means he goes down. On the Companions phase, we're going to start with this archer. He will be shooting at the Goblin Archer in the distance here. So he receives a +2 to his roll, the Goblin receives +0. So the Goblin gets a 15, the Archer gets a 15, so the shot misses. He's then going to use his second action to wait. Because it is the middle of the night and line of sight is limited to 12 inches, the archers can't actually see each other. So miraculously, the moon broke through and lit this goblin up with moonlight, so he was an easy target. That has since disappeared. So this archer would have had to move forward to take that shot, and he misses. His companion down here is going to take a shot against that goblin archer in the distance. He receives +2. The goblin archer receives +0. So we have a 7 from the archer and an 11 from the goblin, so the attack misses. I shall activate the guardsman, who will move into combat with this goblin. He'll be fighting with a +3 and additional +2 for having a mate there, so +5 against the goblin's +1. So we have an 18 for the goblin and an 8 for the guardsman. So the goblin wins that one there. 18 versus armor 11 of the guardsman does 7 points of damage, and the guardsman is killed. Final companion is this man-at-arms who will be fighting that goblin. He receives +3 and the goblin receives +1. So he gets a 23, natural 20 as well, so a critical hit. Not that it matters. And the goblin receives a 15, so he'll be taking a buttload of damage and going down. We'll finish turn 4 with the event phase. So flipping over the next card, 8. And 8 means we have 2 goblin soldiers appear on the edge opposite we deployed on. So we'll deploy 2 more goblin soldiers over here. Here we are at the end of turn 4. Alright, the Rangers phase on turn 5. Let's start by activating Reuben the Ranger and 2 of his companions. Let's say these 2. So Reuben is going to use his first action to move into the tent, followed by these 2 moving up to 6 inches, and 1 each they're going to take on those archers. Reuben's second action will be to cut loose Edmund the Ox and save the prisoner. This fella's second action will be to attack that archer. Those are the wrong dice. That was well done. Video magic. Don't pick up the wrong dice. So the man-at-arms over here is receiving +3 and the goblin archer receives +0. So we have a 5 for the man-at-arms and a 4 for the goblin. So the man-at-arms wins, but doesn't cause any damage. And the same thing over here. We have a 22 for the man-at-arms and a 6 for the goblin archer. So 22 minus 11 armor of the goblin archer means that goblin archer is killed. And then it's on to the creature phase. Let's begin the creature phase by moving these 2 goblins to the side 9 inches. Well, let's start with 6 inches towards the center tent, and then 3 inches towards the closest target, which just happens to be that man-at-arms. Then we'll do combat between these 2. So the goblin archer receives +0, the man-at-arms receiving +3. A 20 from the goblin is definitely going to win him that. 20 versus armor of 12 does 8 points of damage, so this man-at-arms is left with 1 point. Our creatures in this game, when they get natural 20s, it counts as an auto win, but they don't do the extra damage. And then the final creature is this goblin archer, who will be shooting this man-at-arms. The goblin archer receives +1, the man-at-arms receives +3. So a 16 for the goblin archer versus a 12 for the man-at-arms means the goblin archer will win. 16 versus armor 12 means he does 4 points of damage, leaving the man-at-arms with 8 left. It is now the companion's turn. First off, we'll start with the prisoner, Edmund the Ox, who will use his activation to exit the tent. He does, however, only receive 1 activation, so that's as far as he can go. Alright, let's activate this archer next. He'll be shooting at the goblin archer in the distance. The Goblin Archer receives +0. The Human Archer receives +2. So the Goblin Archer gets a 19 versus the Human's 12, so the attack misses. And the Archer's just going to stay there. The second Human Archer is within range of those Goblins there, so he's going to shoot at the closest Goblin Soldier. The Goblin Soldier receives +1. The Archer receives +2. So the Archer gets a 17. The Goblin gets a 13, so the 17 hits. 17 versus the Goblin's armor of 12 means it does 5 points of damage, and that Goblin has 5 remaining. And the final companion to activate will be this man-at-arms here. Things are looking a little bit dire on the right side there, so we're going to move 6 inches over this way. And then can we get into combat? We can. We'll go 3 inches into combat with that Goblin. So the man-at-arms receives +3, the Goblin receives +1. The Goblin gets a 20 total, the man-at-arms gets a 10. So the Goblin definitely wins that. A 20 on 12 means he takes 8 points of damage, and because he had 5 left, that attack kills him. The turn 5 event card is a 10. A 10 means we deploy 2 Goblin soldiers in front of tent 2. Here at the end of turn 5, things are starting to look quite dire. Alright, let's start the Ranger's turn. We will start by activating Reuben the Ranger and the prisoner Edmund the Ox. Edmund will move 5 inches towards his table edge. And that's all that he can do, only one action. And Reuben will use his action to exit the tent. And his second action is going to be to back the F up. Just that way. On the creature's turn, starting with the creatures with the most health, I'm going to rush this Goblin over here, and he will attack that man-at-arms. The Goblin receives +1 for his fight, +2 for having a friend in combat, and an additional +1 because he has the gang up rule, which means he gets an additional +1 when he's got a friend in combat. So the Goblin has +4 versus the man-at-arms +3. That is an 8 and an 8. So the fight is even, but neither model has rolled high enough to cause any damage. We'll follow that up by activating this Goblin. He'll be fighting against the man-at-arms. So the Goblin will have +0 for his fight, +2 for having a friend in combat, and an additional +1 from the gang up rule. So he's looking at +3 versus the man-at-arms at +3. So the Goblin gets a 9, the man-at-arms gets a 6, so the Goblin wins, but he hasn't done enough damage to wound the man-at-arms. This Goblin, we're moving towards the closest enemy, the man-at-arms there. The man-at-arms again gets +3, the Goblin gets +1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6. So the Goblin gets a 17 versus the man-at-arms 5, which means he takes more than enough damage to kill him. This Goblin will be moving towards his closest target, Reuben the Ranger. He's within 6 inches. And he will be using his second action to fight. So the Goblin receives a +1. Reuben receives +3. You can't even see those. There is a 3 there from Reuben and a 15 from the Goblin. So 16 is definitely going to win that fight. However, now it's time for Reuben to use some of his special abilities. So we're going to use Hand of Fate to re-roll that dice. A 9 is better. Still not enough though. So that gets us to 12. And he'll also use his parry ability to add 10 to that, getting him up to 22. 22 versus the Goblin 16 means he wins that fight. And he's going to choose to push that goblin back 1 inch, but he can't deal any damage. This wounded goblin here will be moving 6 inches towards his closest target. And then an additional 3 with his second action, which is going to get him into combat with Reuben. The final creature to activate will be the Goblin Archer here, who will be shooting at his closest target, that Man-at-Arms. The Goblin Archer receives +1, the Man-at-Arms receives +3. The Goblin Archer gets an 8, the Man-at-Arms gets a 15, so the shot misses. Right, let's start the companion phase by getting stuck in. So we'll start with this archer. He'll be moving up to 6 inches into combat with that goblin soldier. And his second action will be to fight a combat. So he will receive 2 +2 for having a friendly in combat, so he'll be at +4, while the goblin is at +1. So 18 + 4 is 22. And 16 + 1 is 17, so the archer wins. 22 against the goblin's armor of 12, means he takes 10 points of damage and goes down. We'll follow this up with the second archer there. He will shoot at that goblin. He receives +2, and the goblin receives +1. So we have a 15 from the archer and a 4 from the goblin, so it definitely hits. 15 against armor 12 means that goblin takes 3 points of damage. It has 7 left. That archer will then use his second action to move 6 inches up here. Then we have this Man-at-Arms here. He will be moving 6 inches in order to attack that Goblin Archer. So the Man-at-Arms receives +3, the Goblin Archer receives +0. So we have 15 from the Man-at-Arms and 7 from the Goblin Archer. 15 versus armor of 11, means the Goblin takes 4 points of damage, which is enough to kill it. In the event phase of turn 6, we'll turn over another card, a red 9. Red 9 means that we put 2 unsuspecting goblins in front of tent number 3. Unsuspecting goblins are just goblins that have been sleeping and haven't prepared themselves for the fight, so they're not wearing armor or carrying a shield. Here we are at the end of turn 6. Things are getting a little bit desperate. Let's start the Ranger phase of turn 7 by activating Reuben the Ranger and his 2 archer companions. Careful. The 2 archers will move here and here, and Reuben will move 6 inches. Move 2 around his companion, and then 4 back this way. They'll all then make a shooting action. So the first archer here will be shooting at that goblin. He receives +2. The goblin receives +1. That goblin one really is cocked, so I'm going to re-roll that. So the goblin gets a 20. The archer, or 21, the archer gets an 11, so that attack misses. This archer will then shoot at that goblin as well. Same thing, the archer receives +2, the goblin receives +1. The goblin has got a 16, and the archer has got an 11, so that attack also misses. And Reuben the Ranger is going to shoot at the goblin over here if he was within line of sight. Due to the darkness, he is. So he'll make that shot. He has a shoot value of +2 against the goblin's fight of +1. So the goblin gets a 7. Reuben gets a 6, so the attack misses. On the creature phase, this first unsuspecting goblin is going to rush into that man-at-arms and fight in combat. So the unsuspecting goblin gets +1 to his fight. The man-at-arms gets +3. So we have 14 from the goblin and we have 5 from the man-at-arms. They're not having much luck today. So 14 versus armor of 12 means that that man-at-arms will take 2 points of damage. The next goblin to activate will be this one. We'll move 6 inches to there and then use his second action to move another 3 into combat. Then we have these goblins on the side. He'll be moving 6 inches to here, followed by a further 3 into combat with that archer. These two goblins cannot draw line of sight on anybody, so they move towards the front of the tent there. 6 inches, followed by a further 3 as they can now draw line of sight to a target. This one, 6 inches, and he is going to take a shot at that archer there. So he is +1 to a shoot. The archer gets +2 to his defense roll. So we have a 3 from the goblin and a 4 from the human, so the shot misses, but neither the shot nor the dodge were particularly exciting. Alright, and the last goblin to activate will be this one here, who moving towards his closest target is going to be that archer. He will then fight. He gets fight 1, +2 for a friend, and +1 for the gang up rule. So here's fight 4 versus the fight 2 of the archer. So the goblin gets a natural 20, which means it automatically wins. So 24 versus the goblin's 24 versus the archer's armor of 11 means that it does 13 points of damage, which is enough to kill that archer. We're then on to the companions phase. So Edmund the Ox will be moving 5 inches towards the edge of the board. But he only gets 1 action, so that's as far as he can go. And the man-at-arms over the side here, in order to try and hold off those goblins, that man-at-arms is going to elect not to fight this turn. On the event phase of turn 7, we flip over a card and get a jack. A jack means we place 2 goblin soldiers in front of tent 1. Things are looking a little dire. Here we are at the end of turn 7. Looks like Edmund might just get away, but not many others are going to make it. Alright, this is it. Beginning of turn 8 now, I believe. We'll start with the Rangers phase. We're going to start by activating Reuben the Ranger, Edmund the Ox, because he is within 3 inches. Watch out for that tree. And we may as well do that archer as well. So let's start with Edmund the Ox. He'll be moving 5 inches, which I think is just enough to get him off the board. And Reuben the Ranger will be moving 6. We shall get this archer also moving back 6 inches. He won't be moving because if he moves, then that will force combat between these 2 goblins, and he doesn't really want to be mobbed by goblins right now. So we'll leave him there. For the second actions, Reuben the Ranger is going to bugger off as well, 3 inches. And our archer here is going to shoot at the closest goblin there. So he receives +2 from his shoot stat, and the goblin will receive +1 to defend. So we have a 7 from the archer and a 3 from the goblin. So the archer does hit, but he doesn't hit in a place that causes any damage. That is the Ranger phase done. Let's begin the creature phase at the top here with the unsuspecting goblin soldiers. So the first one of those is going to attack that man-at-arms. It will be +4, +1 for its fight, +2 for having a friend, and plus an extra 1 for having the gang up roll against the man-at-arms fight of 3. So the man-at-arms gets a 16 versus the goblins 6. So 16 versus armor 10 means the goblin will take 6 points of damage, and why not, we'll force it back an inch. The next one down is going to do the same thing. He only gets +1 to his fight this time though, and +3 for the man-at-arms. That I'm pretty sure is a 19, so 20 for the goblin, and 21 for the man-at-arms. So the man-at-arms wins that. 21 versus the goblin's armor of 10 means he kills that goblin outright. Down the bottom here we have this goblin moving into contact with the archer. He receives fight 1 versus the archer's fight 2. The archer gets a natural 20, so he gets a critical hit, so he automatically wins that fight. We'll push that goblin back 1 inch. And he will do 20 versus armor 12, 8 points of damage, +5 for the crit, means he kills that goblin outright. The next goblin will move in. Same thing again, fight 1 versus fight 2. The goblin gets a 13, the archer gets an 8, so the goblin wins that fight, and 13 versus armor 11 means he does 2 damage to that archer, giving him 8 points remaining. The next goblin will move in. This time the goblin is fight 4 because of his friend versus 2 for the goblin. 2 for the archer. The goblin definitely wins that with a 23. 23 versus armor of 11 does 12 points of damage and means that archer goes down. The goblin archer here will be shooting at the man-at-arms there. The goblin archer receives +1, the man-at-arms receives +3. So a 16 from the goblin beats a 12 from the man-at-arms. 16 minus the man-at-arms armor of 12 means 4 points of damage. So he's got 2 left. This goblin here will be moving around his fellows 3 inches to there, and then 3 inches forward, and his second activation will be 3 inches forward into combat. And the last one, the wounded goblin here, 6 inches straight towards the last target he can see, followed by his second action, moving him into combat. And that is the end of the creature phase. On the companion phase of turn 8, our man-at-arms is going to go down in a blaze of glory and try and kill this wounded goblin. He is fight 3 versus the goblin's fight of 4. So he receives a 17, the goblin gets a 7, so the man-at-arm wins. 17 versus armor 12 means he does 5 points of damage, and the goblin has 2 remaining. And that is the end of turn 8, and I think we can call that a victory for the forces of Goldenfield, though the cost was horrendous. Well, that rescue mission teetered on the edge of disaster. I reckon if I'd mucked around for a turn longer, then things could have been very different. I haven't played Rangers in the Shadow Deep for a long time. I think it showed. I made quite a few little mistakes that I probably wouldn't have if I was more experienced with it. So successfully completing the mission means we are going to get Edmund the Ox back, though it may take a game before he's actually back in our Oathmark campaign, as he'll have to recover from his trials a little bit. Anyway, let me know what you thought of the game in the comments down below. Thank you very much for sticking around, and I do hope we'll see you next time. Cheers.